Well, in what is being described by the Green Party as a transition package to more sustainable farming systems in New Zealand, with almost $300 million earmarked in the agricultural policy recently released, the party is hoping to introduce a fertiliser levy, effectively a tax on the use of synthetic nitrogen, and the ban of the use of palm kernel, leaving farmers nervous on feed options as we head into uncertain times as we farm and grow under a warming climate. Joining us now to discuss is Green Party co-leader James Shaw. Kia ora, James, and firstly, welcome to Sarah's Country. It's lovely to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I think this is the first time that we've had this opportunity, so I appreciate it.
Of course, heading into an election, we do have a lot to cover. First off, set us the scene on your successes under a coalition with Labour in the last 3 years.
Well, look, I think that for the first time that we were in government with ministers, we've actually demonstrated that we can punch above our weight class. Remember, we've only got 8 members of parliament in total. And the thing that I'm most proud of is having reached across the aisle and worked with National and created a cross-party consensus on the long-term direction over climate change. Because, of course, that has been something that's been very contentious in New Zealand. And it's been very difficult for business to invest because they're just not sure, which way things are going to swing at any given election. And so what we've managed to do is to kind of create a stable policy environment, which means that you should see some significant investment decisions over very long time periods. And I'm really pleased about that.
Your latest agricultural policy announcement has multiple elements in there that go more extreme left on Labour's existing policies, in particular 190 kilos per hectare of a synthetic nitrogen cap wasn't far enough that you wanted to bring in a levy. Why?
Well, we think that it is important to send a price signal. So we have set it quite low. We looked at what the cost would be to the average dairy farm, and it's about $1,500, which is enough, I think, to make people think, can we be more efficient with this and reduce the liability without actually putting anybody at risk. On the flip side, 100% of that revenue goes back into the farming community via that $300 million fund that we're talking about. So the money becomes a contribution to what is actually a pretty large package of support from the taxpayer for the transition.
So let's call it a tax, because that effectively is what it is in other ways of petrol to roads and tobacco to health. So effectively coming out with more tax to redistribute to your intentions. However, in this Farmers Weekly article, you've stated you're not going to be overly prescriptive with where it's being said, and of course helping indebted farmers get off the hamster wheel. Is that effectively the Green Party subsidising farming?
Well, one of the things that we've heard very clearly from farmers around the country over the course of the last 3 years is that they want to move in this direction, but people are feeling quite stuck. And the one thing that virtually every farmer that I've said to is, look, we want to do this. It's just we need a bit of support on the ground. And so, in our view, without kind of trying to create some massive bureaucracy or anything like that, we're saying, look, why don't we just start with, a fairly significant pot of money, and then, different farmers can apply to that for loans or grants or specialist support, whatever is needed in any particular location to help make it. Because we understand, different farm types, different soil conditions and climate conditions, the different starting point that different farm systems are at mean that, one size is definitely not going to fit all.
Absolutely. And when it comes to that too, one size definitely doesn't fit all in terms of $300 million being anywhere near enough. In regards to the freshwater policy, I'm hearing from the ground, we're getting close to $1 billion it's going to cost for farmers in New Zealand to meet that. So, as well as all of the other elements around it, do you strongly believe that this is enough, or is it just another figure for voters?
Well, you've got to start somewhere. So if you take that $700 million that we've put in to support the sector through the Freshwater program, this $300 million, that is $1 billion worth of support. We know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but this is an initial commitment. And the view that I take is let's see how it goes. And if we get a couple of years down the track and it looks like we need to crank it up, then let's make that decision at the time.
And also palm kernels on the table. There is a lot of direction already happening on the ground. I mean, you look at what Fonterra is doing and Sinlay to eradicate palm kernel from our system. So this is already underway. But the thing is, James, we also have a catch-22. It's called drought. And when we have a drought, we have a lack of feed to feed the immediate need. So, of course, one thing is great for the long term, but short term, you can't just ban things.
Well, I mean, as you say, actually PKE is getting managed down by the sector because people recognise the horrendous cost of creating that PKE in the first place. I mean, the burn off of much of Indonesia's rainforest and the replacement with palm plantations has a horrendous effect, not just in Indonesia but on all of Southeast Asia, with smoke clouds and so on, affecting neighbouring countries. So people do want to get out of it. And there is a lot, as you say, there's a lot of activity happening there. I would say that we just need to be a bit more innovative and look for other opportunities. And I would say that New Zealand grain growers would be a perfectly good substitute.
Okay, in terms of how farmers are already progressing, they're just calling out for yourself as Minister for Climate Change to understand things from the ground. And one particular area is, of course, sequestration from native trees and riparian planting. And the other is in terms of mapping our soils to, one, protect them from urbanisation sprawl, but also, two, to be able to understand sequestration of our soil carbon, both which those two areas are not gaining any attention.
Actually, we have heard that, and so last year we asked Ministry for the Environment and Ministry for Primary Industries to essentially reopen that work program, and that's aligned with the work that we're doing through the He Waka Eka Noa work program with the sector on the measurement, management and pricing of farm level emissions. So the holy grail of what we're trying to get to with that is a farm level system that looks at all of the sources of your emissions, but also at all of the possible sequestration opportunities that you have on farm. And then where we hope to get to is, those two things will be netted off against each other, and that'll spit something out at the end. And if you're above the number, you might get pinged, and if you're below it, then you get a reward for it. That's kind of where we eventually want to get to. So we are looking at soil sequestration. We are looking at small non-forest planting like riparian strips and shelter belts and things like that.
And let's talk about reward, because to be able to be in the black, we can't be in the red. Every farmer in New Zealand wants to achieve this current government's goal of being the most sustainable food and fibre producers in the world. Yet you know what wool prices are doing. And also to the struggles without some layoff in legislation to ensure that we've got delayed rainfall, i.e. water storage, ability to achieve profitability behind the farm gate to achieve your goals.
Yeah, look, I actually don't think that we've made as much progress on water storage as I would have liked to in this last 3-year term, and it is something that I'll be putting a bit more pressure on the system to respond in the next 3 years. When we made the decision very early on about the funding for the really large scale, the sort of industrial scale irrigation schemes, Cabinet did actually say, that we weren't excluding all water storage, and we had a series of principles for the kind of water storage that we would support, but there hasn't been a lot of activity off the back of that, and that's really what I want to build on and make sure that we are actually developing really good, resilient, sort of distributed network of water storage in our most vulnerable regions.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ideas that were on the table prior as well that now everybody's coming back to were a good idea in the first place, and I'll talk about the Hawke's Bay as an example of that. Just to close, in regards to wool, it is the most sustainable renewable fibre, a sequestration of carbon. It is at an all-time low. What will the Green Party do to avoid the animal welfare issue, which is the farmers are now paying to take wool off the back of these animals?
Yeah, I think you might be hinting at the Building for the Future program that we've got. Which it's only in a sort of reasonably early stage of maturity, but we do want to start sourcing our construction materials from natural, woods and fibres around New Zealand. And so the idea is saying, actually, the more sustainable a building is in terms of its construction, then by definition, you're actually using natural materials from as close to the point of use as possible. And so that includes wool. And so, as you say, it's a fantastic insulating material. And I think that there are real opportunities there for the sector.
And of course, politics, where there has been certain things floating around that the potential to be in a position to go with either side could potentially be on the table. James, are you feeling secure that Labour will have you back, and is the door open with Judith?
Well, I mean, frankly, in answer to the second part of the question is fairly academic if you look at the polling. I think the question will be really how large is the majority that Labour get. I do think that we will be not just back in Parliament but also back in government with the Labour Party. I think that we have done a good job over the last 3 years of working in partnership with them, and that we have demonstrated that we are a stable and responsible partner in government, and can be trusted to deliver on some of the really thorny issues that are facing the country.
Like the economic recovery.
Absolutely. And look, I know we're in an extraordinary time right now. I think right across the political spectrum, there is a broad level of consensus, not 100%, but a very broad level of consensus that we do need to put significant amounts of liquidity into the economy to stimulate the economy and to get us through this particular downturn to the maximum extent possible. Lots of arguments about what you put that stimulus towards, of course, and that's entirely appropriate in an election campaign. The view that I have is that, in particular in the fields of the built environment, we had a 30-year deficit. So if you're talking about rural roads or urban public transport systems or housing, obviously, or our schools and our hospitals, or in our water storage and our three waters infrastructure, we've got these enormous and very expensive problems that we have been storing up for several decades. And because all of those chickens were largely coming home to roost about the time that the pandemic hit. And so what I would argue is that given that we have this requirement to inject enormous sums of capital into the economy right now, then we ought to be putting every dollar of that stimulus to work, trying to resolve some of those long-term challenges facing the country. Otherwise, future generations will end up paying twice, once to pay off the debt that we're running up to get ourselves through the crisis, and once to deal with those unresolved issues that we've failed to resolve so far.
Thank you so much, James. It's been a pleasure you joining us here on Sarah's Country. Co-leader for the Green Party, James Shaw.
This is Sarah's Country.